Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Coalition for Conservation's launch in Victoria. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Cristina Talaco, the chair of Coalition for Conservation, or C4C, and we are a forum for conservatives, including members of the Liberal and National parties who advocate for conservation and for sensible action on climate while supporting the economy. And for the past 4 years, we've been hosting events in water and waste management, in renewables, in clean technologies and EVs, and we've been gathering momentum. So now we have 3,500 supporters nationally, including many in Victoria, and for this reason, we decided to expand our presence in Victoria, where we see great opportunities for our growth. So tonight we have the privilege of having Tim Wilson and Bridget Vallence for our launch. We will first hear from Tim, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions straight after his speech. We will then hear from Bridget and from our C4C directors in Victoria. And after that, we'll run a Q&A a little bit more focused on the Victorian environment and climate landscape. So please type your questions in the Q&A box on your screen during the event. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tim Wilson, the federal member for Goldstein. Having been the Director of Climate Change Policy for the Institute of Public Affairs and having signed up to the Parliamentary Friends of Climate Action Group last year, Tim has been an important voice within the coalition supporting prudent and effective climate policy. In one of his tweets, he said that unlike Labour, who had no plan to reduce emissions without wrecking the economy, we are leading the energy transition, getting emissions down and not costing jobs. And for those of you who attended our C4C webinar last week with UK's former Prime Minister David Cameron, his message was very similar. David said that we must not leave conservation and climate to the left, otherwise it will be all about more taxes and more legislation. So the coalition is much better placed to advance this agenda responsibly. Tim also said at Parliament in March this year that the argument that because Australia represents a small share of global emissions, we should not take action is flawed, because responsibility actually goes to the core of being a Liberal. So welcome, Tim. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will hand it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Christina, for a very kind introduction and for the opportunity to be part of this exciting and important launch in Victoria for Coalition for Conservation. And the basis of, I guess, my enthusiasm in this space is because it comes back to, and you just mentioned it before, core principles to me, which are the ones that motivate me in political life. Yes, I represent a community that's very conservation minded, and it is. We're blessed to be living near Port Phillip, and so we have a natural affinity with keeping our waterways clean and healthy. And of course, also make sure that we're taking care of our cliffs and local environment, because we're blessed to live in one of the best parts of Melbourne. Of course, as an Australian, we are blessed with one of the greatest continents on earth, and as a politician, but also as a citizen, we share that equal responsibility to steward a healthy environment from one generation to the next, and to at least pass on to future generations an environment that is on par, if not better, than the one that we have inherited. And that's really the principles that motivated my involvement in public life. In the end, as a nation, as Liberals, we have a responsibility not just to ourselves, but to the country we hand to future generations. Now, this is not an anathema to our values. In fact, it's the crystallisation of our values. Edmund Burke, who famously wrote about the social contract between generations, where it was not just about doing what is right for those who are alive today, but of course for those that are unborn into the future. It's also about the social contract we have with each other, about making sure that we create a healthy environment that's sustainable for to support our community and our country. And so that sense of responsibility rests with all of us, but that doesn't mean that there is an important role for government as part of that discussion. And when I go to school kids and speak to them in class, the first thing I always talk about is the importance of responsibility, because it's core to Liberal values, and we believe in it in making sure people are economically responsible and prudent in taking care of themselves. We believe it in terms of having a social system that's united and pays mutual respect to others, but the same principles ultimately remain the same for the environment. And so the conversation I often have with school kids is about the importance of doing very basic things on a day-to-day basis, like collecting rubbish and cleaning your room. It sounds like I'm probably going all a bit Jordan Peterson on everybody, but it's very much a very basic value that sits at the core of who we are. If we are not here to be responsible stewards of our economy, society, and environment and community, then what is our purpose? I think it's core and central to who we are. And that's why I think these initiatives are so important, because you shouldn't just do things for votes. I think one of the greatest criticisms that can be levelled at politicians, quite justly, is that people take positions based on votes or because of attitudes or sentiments. In fact, the most important thing in all policy spaces that we engage is that we do it with passion and we do it with vigour. No one's going to buy a health system from a health minister who doesn't believe in the strength and the value of their arguments. The same is true in the education sphere. And the same must also be true in the environmental sphere as well. And let's face it, as Liberals, we're very good at talking about the economy and its importance. And it is important. It's extremely important. And it's important because it has both welfare benefits for people, but also because it has environmental benefits for people. And I see today in newspaper articles in The Australian, there's a new book out talking about one of the major economic impacts, one of the major negative impacts of a weak economy is ultimately environmental externalities that come associated with people not properly caring for their environment. Anyone who's studied looking at some of the issues around the environment in the developing world will be able to attest to that. So we need to do it with passion and to make sure there's a vigour in our passion in approaching environmental issues. And I say that because while we're focusing on the economy, we need to refocus and reaccustomize ourselves with many of the issues I think that have dominated a large part of the Liberal tradition around conservation, which we've left by the wayside. Of course, the national conversation, international conversation in recent years has been heavily dominated around issues of climate change and what that means. And it's a very important issue. But if you look at the long pedigree of Liberal thinkers, Liberal governments in Australia, there has always been a very strong focus on conservation as part of the Liberal story. And you just need to look and go onto the party's website and look at the achievements of various governments. It was, of course, the Fraser government that made the Great Barrier, or gave the Great Barrier Reef initial protection and recognition. There are, of course, many initiatives during the Howard government era, as well as the Fraser government, all the way back through other governments around land care and land use. And many people rightly point out that some of the greatest conservationists of the natural environment are the farming community, who understand the consequences directly of the misuse of land and how it should be appropriately used and addressed. So we need to do this not just for the pursuit of votes, so that's very important, but we should be doing it because we believe in it and because it comes back to our core about who we are. And I think that where we're most effective in a lot of these discussions is not pursuing the highfalutin. It's not when we're pursuing the measures or the objectives, which can sometimes be distant or esoteric, but where we can be practical in our approach so that people can take responsibility and be part of the solution. And I think that's sometimes what's being missed in the national conversation. We have, of course, the Greens who are out there who want to always pursue global concerns, disconnected from any capacity really to measure the outcome of their impact. As long as they remain distant, they win the argument. You have Labor who take a similar view, but a mixture between the international and the domestic, but still every answer in the Labor Party narrative is only achieved through the empowerment of themselves. Whereas our focus, consistent with our values, is what we can do as individuals, working collaboratively together to affect change. And that's not just important because we believe in that as an approach, because we believe in a nation empowered by 26 million individuals, not by a couple of 100,000 bureaucrats, though that is true. It's important because it actually makes action sustainable. On the weekend, and this is a side discussion, but an example of it, I was helping a local graffiti busters group painting over graffiti in our local area. Now, that is a type of pollution, I guess, so you could chuck it in the environmental conversation. But the basis of my participation in that was remarking to others after painting it how satisfying it was. And they said, well, yes, I guess it is satisfying. And I said, well, actually, there's a reason it's satisfying. It's because a proportionate amount of effort taken on with responsibility by local citizens is able to realise an outcome, which actually makes people want to do more of it because there's satisfaction in their investment and their time and their energy, whereas a constant pursuit of distant objectives by others will never give you satisfaction and will never build a long-term and sustainable commitment to addressing a challenge. And so this is where one of the big gaps in the challenges we all face in areas in policy like climate change is what can we do that's sensible, that's practical, and that empowers individuals to take responsibility. And one of the things I was very happy, I watched the presentation last week, and don't worry, Christina, I wasn't the person who leaked it to, where was it, the Financial Review and the Australian, but there was a very good commission, I thought, actually by Malcolm Turnbull, probably went largely unremarked, which is, despite the theory of emissions trading as a mechanism or a vehicle to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it's worked better in theory than in practice. And that's an argument I've basically been having with Malcolm for about a decade, so I'm very glad to hear him perhaps reflect on that. Because in practice, what works and what's sustainable are measures that are efficient, but also materially have an impact on the ground and help the economy and our environment transition in a sustainable way. And Labor and the Greens will always go up for the big picture, big measures that we very, but will keep people constantly with more power and responsibility. Whereas we can actually work constructively with the business community, with community-based organisations, and of course with willing individuals and entrepreneurs to transform the whole discussion around energy, the environment, climate change and economic growth in a way that makes it sustainable, creates the jobs we want for our children and grandchildren, and continues to boost growth. And by making what we're doing proximate and proportionate and bringing people along with us. Because my view, in the heart of hearts, is the greatest enemy we have in discussions around climate change are not, the people who challenge, scientific views. It's by people who set up impossible standards by which we can meet, and they use that as a vehicle to define the terms of the debate. And this goes back to where you started before, Christina, and the reflections of David Cameron. If you don't define the terms of a discussion, you'll ultimately only get dragged to your opponent's position. And ultimately, to win not just an argument, but to win and advance a cause and an issue, you have to define the problem, and that therefore ultimately informs the pathway for resolution. And while people have been perhaps not as engaged in a lot of environmental conversations, I think that liberal narrative around conservation, environmental care and management has been missing. And what the Coalition for Conservation provides is an opportunity to fill that gap. But it won't happen because we just have discussions on Zoom, though that's important. It'll be about coming up with sensible and practical policy on the community level that brings in participation, which ultimately, as David Cameron outlined last week, provides people for a pathway that if they want to be green, they need to go blue. And I share that sentiment very strongly because it is part of our tradition, it is part of our history, and it should be part of our future around environmental conservation and stewardship. And when Liberals are at their best, it isn't because they accept the terms of the debate of their political opponents and how they want to have a discussion. It's when we have it on our terms and focus on what can practically be achieved as part of a community, a country, and a globe, and to be able to advance our values and our values around conservation through that lens, because the problems like the Greens are the same ones that plague the United Nations, which is to set high and ambitious lofty targets that will never be realised or met without the active participation of citizens and community on the ground. And so that's the basis in which I engage with conservation, and the basis in which I applaud the efforts of the Coalition Conservation as a critical part of knitting the fabric of a future Liberal conservation movement.
Thank you so much, Tim. Well, you're making us feel very encouraged with your comments. We totally agree that as Liberals, we do a lot for the environment and conservation, but we don't celebrate what we do, and we have to actually spread the message in a much stronger and louder way. And as you pointed out, it's inclusive of not just climate change, it's inclusive of plastics in the ocean, of graffiti. In fact, I saw your social posts on graffiti. I was very, impressed that you were, supporting that cause as well. So, it comes from grassroots and from community, of course. So thank you so much for those comments, and mindful of your time, I think I will start straight away reading the questions that we have for you here from the participants. So the first question is, how do you expect to continue to hold seats like your own, like Higgins and Kooyong, when an increased number of voters in these areas are of the view that our party has no firm policy position or principles on climate action, environment, and conservation?
So the way we engage with voters is to recognise or build a sense of connection between what we're practically offering and their lived experience. Of course, there will be voters who we will never win over. I mean, the reality is if you're a voter where the environment is your primary consideration and no other matters or no other issues factor into your thinking, we are very unlikely to win that person's vote, because we are not a party of single issues. We are a party of government, and we have to balance out by competing considerations of the effect on all of those issues that we're used to: the economy, society, the nation, national security, etc. But for the mainstay, what people actually want is confidence that we're taking these issues seriously, and to make sure that they see that confidence not just in word but in deed. The way we do it locally in Goldstein, I started with these points in my address, is by thinking about the big national issues and international, particularly in the climate space, and anchoring it to something that's practical and useful in the community. And so one of the things that I took to the last election very strongly was the need to deal with conservation of Port Phillip and finding pathways for us to do so with local water management groups. And because it has multiple prongs, it deals with issues around wastewater that come out through the McNamara electorate and make their way onto our beautiful beaches and spill pollution. It comes down to issues around coastal erosion, which are affected both by water runoff from Beach Road, if you know my electorate, as well as the issues around sea levels and how they move with tides and the impact it has on coastal erosion as well. So working through those practical measures to address the bigger macro picture and then getting people's participation and involvement in it. But it can't be one you do reactively. It's one that you have to take a position of leadership on, and then take that as part of building that sense of confidence. But of course, naturally as well, people want to have confidence in our policies. So having a consistency in the approach we take so that people are hearing a consistent message is critical, because if they don't, they'll only ultimately hear the points of division or points of difference. And in a space where we need to come up with practical solutions which reinforce our brand, that is going to be a critical part of the discussion going forward. But I come back to my remarks before. I think that we're the only ones who can actually build sustainable policy, because we're the only ones who are actually thinking about how do you factor in all of those other considerations in policy to be presented to the Australian people. So you're never going to get the extreme Greens, but you are going to get mainstream people who are concerned about their job, they're concerned about their health, they're concerned about their local community, and they're concerned about the environment as well.
Thanks, Tim. The next question is, Australia is in the midst of an extinction crisis. Can the current review of our national environment laws help solve this problem?
So the current review of national environment laws is actually mostly to look at the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is to look at what approval mechanisms are necessary for national environmental laws to make sure that projects go through the appropriate processes, but also meet the proper tests. So I think one of the things we've got to do is really change the conversation around what the purpose of this legislation is. It isn't to stop projects going ahead. It's to make sure that they meet proper standards and proper tests. And maybe some of the conversation needs to be to recognise the balance in the law, which is for simplification, it comes sometimes with higher standards. Whereas the piece of legislation that's mostly focused on process, but not actually much on outcomes. And I think, and this comes back to my point around localised solutions, you always have it tied to outcomes rather than in that we'll find more effective.
Right. A more political question here. Labour's opposition to coal at the last federal election caused the regional backlash for the LP in Queensland. However, at the same election, the Liberal Party went backwards in Victoria, now holding 12 out of 38 seats. Do you believe there's a fundamental ideological divide between Queensland and Victoria with regard to energy and environmental policy issues? And if so, how can this be reconciled to ensure the Liberal Party wins more seats in Victoria?
The point I was making earlier, which is the reconciliation occurs different urgent groups, because the primary consideration of commuting as a consequence of issues like coal were not because of a particular love affair with black minerals.
We're losing you a little bit, Tim. Sorry.
People don't go. Oh,
it might be your connection or something.
Apologies, it's my. Okay, I have the best connection available, courtesy of our wonderful friends at Telstra. It's not because people have a love affair with coal. It equates to their job, it equates to their financial security to support their family. And that's no different to exactly the same security considerations that people in Victoria are concerned about around making sure they have a healthy environment and conditions that help them, but also make sure that they're able to provide a sustainable livelihood for their community. I'm going to stop video because it might help with the audio. And
correct,
again,
that's great.
I'm sure that everybody needs to look in the mirror every morning. So I think it's about finding that sense of commonality in the bond between different policy areas rather than going to extreme positions. And this is where I think it's just so critically important to divide out the division between those people who are never going to support us and a measured and practical solution. The other one, of course, is, I'm a great fan of saying the future is going to be awesome. And I believe that because I believe in the power of technology to be part of the solution. And I really think we've got to be more confident in building up a narrative around technology as being part of the solution. We should never allow that to be left to our political opponents to dominate that conversation or define it. And that's why I think we have to be very open about considering options like nuclear power. In fact, I said to my staff the other day, for some amusement, I'm pro the science of climate change, I'm pro the science of vaping, I'm pro the science of genetically modified foods, and I'm pro the science of nuclear power. But it isn't the be-all and end-all nuclear power. It needs to be part of the conversation, as are other types of technologies like hydrogen. And I think we're actually in a strong position here because a lot of people have been critical, for instance, the adoption of gas as part of the discussion around energy transition. But actually one of the chief reasons is because of its flexibility, or the infrastructure's flexibility to be used for the adoption of hydrogen into the future. This is the point the chief scientist makes. So we can have a very strong conversation on the importance of technology as part of that solution, which also creates jobs sustainably to address concerns around security that may exist in some communities that continue to rely on fossil fuels. But it's not an overnight conversation, and it's not an overnight policy plan. It needs to be done incrementally.
Thanks, Tim. How are you going for time? Are you able to take another two questions? Or
5 more minutes.
5 more. Okay, here we go. I will leave the questions that are very Victorian focused for later for Bridget, because I think she's better placed to answer. So I'll ask you this one. Tim, Michael Schellberger, in his book, Apocalypse Never, highlights the fact that 100% renewables would require increasing the land use for energy from today's 0.5% to 50%. This is not sustainable for conservation of natural environments. So how will the Liberal Party tackle this complex issue while reducing emissions?
Well, I don't disagree with the general thrust. I have ordered a copy of the book. I haven't read the book, but I did read the summary today in the newspaper, and I've done enough rudimentary analysis of the land use of renewables to recognise that it's one of many parts of their limitations. That's why we've got to look at what we can use in other technologies to drive transitions to other types of fuels. So I mentioned before the importance of hydrogen, and renewables to be part of that, but it's also got to be part of the conversation around alternate technologies, including the role, if there is one, for nuclear power, and that's how you're going to not be entirely dependent on solar and wind. There are, of course, also offshore options like tidal power and the like, and that can have play some part. But a lot of those technologies are still in their relative infancy in terms of their commercial viability. So we've got to look at the full spectrum and what works for us, because we can get a lot of households off centralised energy grids, but the main challenge that we continue to face is the high energy demand that's required in industrial processes. And on the southeast of Melbourne, around just outside of my electorate, there are still a lot of businesses that operate viably, have high energy intensive usage, particularly around gas, because a large part of their activity is around melting metals. And so you've got to provide a substitute or alternative. It isn't going to happen from, well, it can technically happen, but as you point out, the very high greed in terms of land use for things like solar and wind versus alternative fuels like hydrogen.
Thanks, Tim. One more question. As a member of the coalition who is open to action on climate, how can you and other like-minded individuals make an impact on government policy for the better when, as Malcolm mentioned last week, the climate skeptics in the coalition will blow up the whole show if they see any more towards real and effective action on climate?
Well, I'll be frank, I don't accept Malcolm's premise. I know some people will take issue with that, but I found that actually the most disappointing part of his presentation last week. And, you know, I have a good relationship with Malcolm, but I firstly don't think you should ever establish barriers of lack of achievement. And I also don't think that's the modus operandi of many people. I think what they have are legitimate concerns about the economic impacts of different policies. You know, in the end, it comes down to a simple question, which is, are you prepared to give up your job for an environmental outcome? And if your answer to somebody who works in some communities is that their answer should be yes, and you're not prepared to say yes yourself, you've presented your own challenge to yourself, which is, it's got to be part of a transition that recognises and respects shifts in demand over time and provides people with alternative pathways for their livelihoods. And I don't think you can dismiss that by simply saying, well, thermal coal is no longer going to be used. I don't believe that is going to be the case. I think it's going to be a diminishing part of the future of the energy mix in Australia and around the world, but it's going to be part of that. But it's not going to be necessarily a long-term future for economic growth. And I think this is the other point that we need to stress and we need to focus on, which is one of the reasons why there's a challenge around some of these sectors and their viability is because they actually deliver, they're one of the few wealth creating industries of the country, and they should not be dismissed lightly. Coal and other mineral resources are wealth creating industries that don't just create jobs, they actually improve the overall wealth of the nation. So you need to find alternative wealth creating industries to be to continue to provide economic advantage to Australians. And so we obviously have others. We have construction, we have education. So it's what can we do to actually boost the capacity of other sectors to be wealth creating too? Because if you don't address that, it has an impact on things like state government revenue. There's a reason why state Labor governments, despite their rhetoric in Queensland, keep approving new coal mines. It's because they need the cash to maintain our lifestyles and to support their balance sheets. And to dismiss that is to not understand the complexity of the problem and therefore how to unpack it to solve it.
Thank you, Tim. One last question, because I'm also interested in your answer to this one. You are one of several Liberal MPs who have signed on to the Parliamentary Friends of Climate Action Committee. Could you outline the purpose and objectives of this committee?
Well, it's not actually a committee, it's just a parliamentary friendship group. We have them on lots of things from, different countries and support of different countries. I'm obviously a big supporter of the Parliamentary Friends of Hong Kong as but one of many examples. We also have them for different areas of actions on viruses and STIs and the like. So the purpose is really to bring people together to have a conversation and to find where there might be potential avenues for working together, to listen to speakers who are interested in the policy area. And I've had a decade-long interest in climate policy and different responses. And I think one of the things that's defined the past decade, frankly, has been lousy policy. And I'm not just, and I mean that particularly with how the left have defined the terms of the debate. They spent their whole time investing in emissions trading scheme and carbon taxes. And I think they've been lousy policy. And I really mean that. One of the unremarked admissions of Anthony Albanese earlier in the week on 7:30 was acknowledging that you don't need price signals when technologies are already cost competitive or cheaper. And I believe that was always been the trajectory, which is why I appreciated Malcolm's admission that emissions trading works in theory, but not perhaps in practice. I think those are the sorts of things that that sort of conversation about, well, what are alternative policies? I think that, for instance, some of the reverse auction models that are being put up under direct action model and are being proposed as part of, there was an ACCC report a couple of years ago looking at how to get greater energy investment into the grid. Having reverse auctions that include reducing emissions as part of the pricing structure is a good one. But it's not one the left own because they want a one-size-fits-all solution. We need practical policy that sensibly cuts emissions, that helps the economy transition to create a future for Australia.
Thank you, Tim. Well, thank you so much for sharing your views with us. We're thrilled to have had you here tonight with us. So feel free to leave whenever you have your next appointment. But it would be great to have you again at the forthcoming events. We have a really active calendar for the rest of the year. But thank you so much. This is your first appearance for C4C. We're thrilled to have you as our MP as well. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Bridget Vallence, who's the Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change for Victoria, Shadow Minister for Youth on the Victorian Liberal Nationals frontbench, and member for Evelyn. Bridget will share with us how the Liberal Party in Victoria has a proud tradition of ensuring the environment is valued and protected, and how Victorians expect real action on climate change. She'll be touching a bit on the challenges of transitioning to a low carbon economy that creates jobs by taking advantage of renewable resources and existing emerging technologies. So welcome, Bridget, and thanks very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Christina, and to everyone involved in C4C and everyone on the call tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I congratulate you, Christina, and the team for your launch in Victoria. It's an incredibly exciting time to be involved in the environment and climate change portfolio. And of course, whilst we're currently immediately facing an immense challenge with the coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis that's resulting from that, caring for and protecting our environment is still critically important. It's absolutely our job to conserve the environment for future generations, and it should be a comfortable conversation, as Tim's been describing, a comfortable conversation for us as Liberals to talk about the environment, because, as Tim mentioned, it's about conservation. For me, it's about taking advantage of advanced technologies, creating industries and jobs, and an opportunity presents itself for creating a competitive advantage for Victoria. And as Tim said, and I forgot to mention, I think Tim mentioned in his spiel that he talks to many schools, and I do too, and this topic comes up a lot. And he mentioned that he also talks when he goes to schools about cleaning up rooms, and I think, Tim, if you're still on the line, you're welcome to come to my house and talk to my kids about cleaning their room at any stage. But as Tim said, Liberals and the Liberal Party in Victoria has a proud tradition when it comes to ensuring the environment is valued and protected. And it's something that it's important to note that it's Liberal governments in Victoria that have developed and forged their way into environmental legislation, created environmental-based legislation in Victoria. Now, back in 1970, I like to look back often at some of our leaders in the past, and the former Victorian Liberal Premier, Sir Henry Bolte, identified that the environment was a critical and important issue that the electorate would be very interested in and have an expectation for its government. You know, the Bolte government had been looked so much at productivity and progress in that regard, but it was Bolte who identified back in 1970 that the Victorian electorate was shifting its focus and more interested in values and quality of life, which of course the environment is central to. And I'd just like to share a quote of Bolte when he referred to his government and believing that, and I quote, that the quality of life depends upon the preservation and improvement of our environment, the air, the water, the soil, the natural landscape, and the wildlife. And I think in 2020 that the Victorian electorate is, has a similar desires when it comes to the environment that Bolte identified 50 years ago. Today, we know that Victorians are passionate about the environment, that Victorians expect their governments to be able to balance priorities of both the economy and the environment, and they expect real action on climate change. We see that in terms of polling and surveys of Victorians, because they believe that we should be doing everything we can to protect our environment for future generations so that they can enjoy the beautiful natural environment that we live in today. So as the Victorian Liberals and as the Shadow Minister for Environment, we're absolutely up for the challenge. It's a steep challenge given the situation we're facing with coronavirus, but we're taking this seriously and we're in the stages of consulting with communities right across Victoria about what matters most to them, so that we can develop meaningful policies in this space. And because I'm a great believer, and I think Victorians are too, that a healthy environment is so important. And I think Tim referred to this too, that a healthy environment underpins a healthy and strong economy. So that's something that we're definitely passionate about in the Victorian Liberals. And as a member of the Parliament's Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, which is the key committee that is charged with scrutinising the government's budgets and expenditure of taxpayers' money, I know that when you look at budgets and you look at all of the government initiatives, the vast majority of government spend involves an impact on the environment. And so when we look at the situation we're in currently, in the context of recovery from coronavirus, it's so important that, and I think opportune for us to contemplate climate policies and policies relating to the environment and our environmental future when we're looking at the economic recovery. I know that in my community here in the Yarra Valley and communities right across Victoria, businesses and individuals are facing significant hardship as a result of the coronavirus. You've got businesses that have got significant drops in trade, some businesses potentially closing their doors forever. People have lost their jobs, their livelihoods are severely impacted. But we'll get out of this, and in terms of economic recovery, it, as I said, presents an opportunity for government to modernise and look at low carbon initiatives in order to stimulate the economy. Whether it be investing in carbon capture storage, investing in sources of low emissions energy, whether it be investing in green infrastructure or transport. Our transmission network is in great need of investment, or it could be as simple as revitalising, households putting on solar panels. But these are all initiatives that government can do to stimulate the economy to help lift us out of this economic crisis that we're facing. It, as I said, presents a great opportunity for us to have look at stimulus through that lens. And some of the positive policies that we in the Victorian Liberals have already announced can and will play an important role in that. Zero to landfill is one of our key policies that we've already announced well in advance of the 2022 election. And ultimately, this policy is about using household waste and transferring that, using that to generate low emissions energy. As I mentioned to my kids before, and I think that I'm sure that we're a composting household and always have been, and I'm sure my kids are probably sick of hearing me say, why waste your waste? Because waste can always be used, it can be recycled into a new product, or it can be used as feedstock to generate energy. So with our zero to landfill policy, we have a 100% commitment to reduce household waste going to landfill. And we'd like to revitalise the waste industry in Victoria to support advancement in new technologies, in innovative recycling. From my perspective, there is absolutely no reason why in Victoria we can't have an excellence in terms of waste management, make this a competitive advantage, shore up green jobs, and develop and enhance this industry so that we can be best in class when it comes to, to this, and make it, as I said, a competitive advantage for Victoria. So that obviously is around household waste, and it's only part of the mix, and we've got more to say when it comes to other policies in that area down the track. But waste has been, and if there's any if they're all Victorians or any Victorians on the line, people will know that waste in Victoria has been a huge challenge. It's been majorly in crisis in the last few years. Waste, the emerging crisis is squarely on the shoulders of the current Andrews government, who has allowed this issue to explode, really. By example, over 50% of municipal waste was going to just one operator in Victoria, an operator that was completely, now went into administration, but completely ill-equipped to cope with the increasing volume of waste, and completely ill-equipped to cope with the fact that offshoring of waste to China and other Asian markets was closing off. Also, it's not just about household waste piling up in Victoria, but also this government has overseen regulatory failures when it comes to hazardous waste. We've got a number of rogue operators that have stockpiled hazardous and chemical waste, which has put a huge risk to the Victorian community. In the last 3 years, Victorians have had to endure 3 major industrial fires as a result of stockpiled hazardous waste. And this is completely unacceptable. In fact, entire inner suburban communities had to be evacuated because of the situation, because of, terribly toxic air pollution and pollution in the local waterways. And whilst we're on the topic of waste, it's important to note that the EPA, that this really exposed huge failures with our EPA in Victoria, huge regulatory failures. And in fact, an independent report just handed down recently by Ernst & Young highlighted that the EPA was completely incapable of policing toxic waste. And toxic waste is really a sad, prominent topic in Victorian politics at the moment. I'll shift now to the Andrews government and their major infrastructure program in Victoria. And we just have to look at 2 of the key infrastructure projects which are absolutely plagued at the moment. The Westgate Tunnel project and the Melbourne Metro. These projects are costing Victorian taxpayer in excess of $20 billion. They are going into cost overrun and they are severely delayed. And they're plagued not because of industrial disputation, not because of the cost of labour or materials. They're plagued because the Andrews government and its contractor absolutely failed in take into account environmental considerations for these projects. They are faced with having to find a way to dispose of thousands of tonnes of toxic PFAS-ridden soil, which is being dug up as part of the construction. And communities that have heard that they're earmarked for this soil being dumped are up in arms and protesting. And in fact, there's litigation on foot with the Westgate Tunnel project around around who's going to bear the cost of disposing of this toxic soil. Of course, ultimately, that's the Victorian taxpayer. And as I mentioned before, it's so critically important that we care about our environment and we have environment forefront of mind, because it is definitely involved in every economic decision of government. I'd like to just shift a little bit to emissions. Now, whilst energy isn't part of my portfolio, we all know that as we transition to a low carbon economy, reducing our emissions is critically important. And particularly in Victoria, we know that electricity generation contributes to over 50% of CO2 emissions in Victoria. So looking at ways to reduce our emissions through renewables and other low emission sources of energy are extremely important. The Victorian Liberals have long advocated for the low emissions energy from onshore gas, and after the closure of Hazelwood, we felt that it was completely unwise for the Andrews government to continue to retain its moratorium on onshore gas exploration. And because we see that as we transition, and as Tim alluded to, it's important that we have a transition that still takes us to our target that we have. We need to be able to achieve targets, but we need to be realistic in how we get there. That gas is necessarily important as we transition because it's available. It provides a low emissions source of energy generation, and it provides low cost energy, which for businesses and households, as people are will be recovering from coronavirus and the cost of living, they'll be under huge cost of living pressures. This is particularly important. Now, recently, the Victorian government ceded to pressure and agreed to finally lift the ban on onshore gas next year. And why this is so important, it's important for certainty for industry. And I know this only too well because coming from industry and having experience in industry, back when I worked in the automotive industry and at Ford Motor Company, I looked after the energy and electricity and gas contracts for Ford Australia for all of our sites back when we were back in the day when we were producing, around 150,000 vehicles per annum. Ford was Victoria's 5th largest commercial consumer of electricity. And I managed those contracts also around waste, from general waste to industrial and toxic waste, paint sludge through to waste tyres. Being involved in that space, I know how critically important it is for industry to have certainty, for business, and also for jobs. Whether that's certainty in regulation and levies, whether it's certainty from government in terms of supporting innovation and creation of jobs, or whether it's just that clear path to reaching net zero economy, carbon economy, that clarity is so important for industry. So thank you so much for the opportunity to join you all tonight and talk a little bit about what we're doing with developing policies in this space, and our passion mirrors that of the Victorian public. Thanks so much for your time, and again, congratulations on your launch here in Victoria.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for sharing with us all these initiatives. Very impressed with the waste management initiatives. I think that has the ability to strengthen your green credentials for the coalition in the state of Victoria. And I remember David Cameron saying that he strengthened his green credentials when he was actually in opposition, not in government. So it's a very good opportunity. And although there is COVID around and there's challenges with that, it's also a propitious time for change and for rethinking how we do things. So there's a great opportunity there to come up with various ideas on how to reduce emissions. So thank you for sharing all of this with us. There's quite a few questions for you, but before we start asking questions, I would very much like to introduce our directors that we nominated recently in Victoria, who will be, the core of what we do in the state of Victoria. And I'll start with Sali Miftari, and then I'll pass the word to Dai Rule. So Sali has been a party member for many years. He's very passionate about conservation and very focused on building upon the proud history of our party on the environment. He does believe, and he discussed that with me this week, that younger voters must be engaged in this conversation, because without decisive leadership from the center-right, young people will fail to take our party seriously at the future elections. So I will get Sali to say a few words, and he's going to focus on the history of Victoria in the environmental space.
Well, Christina, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and to Bridget and Tim before you. My name is Sali Miftari. I know many of you on the call tonight, and for those that I don't know, I'm looking forward to meeting you in person soon. Now, in preparing for tonight's event, I have spent a little bit of time looking into our party's evolution on policy issues concerning the environment, energy and conservation. Unbeknownst to many on the regressive activist left, and indeed some in our party too, we actually have a really proud history on the environment, often being the world leader, undoubtedly the world leader, in understanding and preserving the natural world when Victorian Liberals have been in government. From legislating the world's first environmental protection framework and a protection agency to facilitate that, to the active establishment of the suburban Green Ledge, which has undoubtedly led to Melbourne being amongst the world's most livable cities, practical Liberal policies have opened up the eyes of millions of Victorians to the wonder of our planet and to the threats that it faces. Even as far back as the 1960s, Conservative Liberal Premier Sir Henry Bolte understood a political reality that is not dissimilar to the reality afflicting us today. The proposed clearing of some of the Little Desert National Park, some 350 kilometres to the west of where I am in Melbourne tonight, was influential on how voters intended to cast their vote at the upcoming 1970 state election, with Melbourne's The Age newspaper polling suggesting that this issue came only second to the ongoing and deadly Vietnam War. Acting on this sentiment, Bolte positioned the environment as central to improving the quality of life in Victoria. And I think he recognised that a solid and indeed protected natural environment was the fundamental building block upon which a modern state can be built. And I think he did build one with Dick Hamer as successor soon after. Reflecting on this and the quote Bridget noted in her comments before, I certainly could not help but observe that this statement rings as true today as it did 50 years ago. It's important to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that this was a Conservative Liberal leader who not only knew that attitudes had changed, but also, perhaps most importantly, understood the inherent pact between citizens and their environment in which they live. The political benefits of this approach and mindset, of course, are evidenced by the very long tenure Bolte and Hamer had in office. By assessing the actions of previous Liberal governments over history, it's clear that our party has leveraged the universal appeal of our natural world and caught the imagination of successive generations to our electoral advantage. I don't want to relitigate the result in 2018. I don't think anyone does. However, I wonder whether our neglect of these attitudes and approach in the past led us to losing once very safe traditional blue ribbon seats in Melbourne. With the next state election, I'm an optimist, and with the next state election a little over 2 years away, now is the time to look ahead. As Liberals, we all draw on a very proud history of environmentalism. That is because conservatism and conservation are natural allies. In reviewing our party's history in the space, I believe that our advocacy should capture the impulse of society to care for and nurture our own surroundings. That is to protect what is vulnerable and precious, to safeguard and improve upon our inheritance, our natural inheritance, so that we can pass on something of great significance and beauty to those who come after us. It's something that Roger Scruton, a noted Conservative thought leader, said was described as the goal towards which serious environmentalism and conservatism both point. That being the home, the place where we are and the place that we share, the place that defines us, that we hold in trust for our descendants, and that we certainly don't want to spoil. Our goal at the Coalition for Conservation here in Victoria is for our party to steward for many years to come a healthy and beautiful natural environment, which we can all enjoy, and one which we are proud to pass on to our next generation. We hope, certainly with you, Bridget, that our party will subscribe to this view as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sali. I'd like to introduce our other director in Victoria, Di Rule. She's on the line. She's a long-term party member, and she feels very strongly about the need for conservatives to control the environment and conversation discussions. She's been an advisor and chief of staff to both federal and state members, and presently serves on several boards and committees, including JMB Foundation, AusNet, and the Royal Children's Hospital Advisory Committee. So she told me she's been inactive for a few years, but she's now back and prepared to advance the environment agenda for C4C in Victoria. So I'd like to introduce Di.
Thank you, Christina, and a special thanks to Tim and Bridget tonight, who've had some wonderful words to say and offer us a lot of hope. I've been a member of the Liberal Party for 30 years. As Christina outlined, I've been served in many roles, either at branch level or state level, including being a candidate twice. I've also worked as a state and federal advisor for more than 15 years. And I know that introducing new policies is difficult. Bridget referred to the steep challenges that it can provoke. But I also know that if we don't soon have a serious conversation about our natural world and develop some sensible policies about how to conserve it, it's the Liberal Party that's going to be extinct. I'm a mother of 3 children in their 30s and a grandmother of 4. And my children want to vote Liberal, but they're questioning why they should continue to vote Liberal. To them, and most of their generation, Liberals don't care about their future, let alone their children's future. So after a few inactive years, I've decided it's time to get active again. Now's the time for all of our party to pull together and to show the next generation we do care about their future, and that we want to pass on a world of which we're proud rather than ashamed. Conservation is a natural conservative issue, as we've heard Bridget and Tim outline tonight. There's no need for us to shy away from it. Conservatives want to conserve the planet and pass it on to future generations. That's what we've always been about. So Liberals must have something to say about conservation, about our natural world and its future, and to thus ensure these future generations supporting us. Of course, the world's far better than it's ever been. We hear all that, depending on which barometers you use, but we've got to accept that it's at the expense of the natural world. Think about air quality, think about rivers, jungles, forests, pollution. This pandemic's allowed us a lot of time to musing about the pandemic, as many people have done. We realise that we've got a chance to reset our priorities. One of the obvious opportunities is our chance to rebuild Australia in a way that's sustainable, in a way that focuses on industries without trashing the environment, that delivers energy solutions without exacerbating global warming. In practical ways, as Tim Wilson was outlining before. It needs to be consistent in our values, but we're all working collaboratively together. In our region, there's going to be a revolution in renewables, and also amongst our trade partners further afield. And Liberals are going to have to ask themselves, do we want to lead this or do we want to follow it? As David Cameron said last week, do we want to be laggards or leaders? Good question for us. Tim also pointed out that we need to have this discussion on our terms. And I think that needs to be really considered carefully. We can't leave it to the left. If we leave it to the left, They'll slap on punitive taxes rather than take positive action. They'll apply restrictive legislation rather than create opportunities. It's up to us to take the lead, to be the ones to show them how. Bridget spoke about the recovery of our economy, and the recovery of our economy, particularly post-pandemic. That's going to require concessions on both sides, concessions from climate change skeptics as well as from environmentalists. But everyone knows that there's something better that we can build. If we approach it in a similar way to how we've tackled COVID, in this country at least, we're going to do quite well. But everyone's going to have to make concessions. We have to accept the science, and we have to accept the uncertainty of the science and come together in a community-spirited way to solve the problem of what type of world we'll pass on to future generations. So let's open the conversation, let's be prepared to talk it through, and let's make sure we've got something to take to our younger generation at the next election.
Thank you so much, Di. A lot of incentive in your words. So thank you for that. And thanks for joining C4C as a director as well in Victoria. So now it's my pleasure to bring Ted Bailu on air, which I'm sorry about before we couldn't unmute him. Ted, welcome. Thank you so much for the support you've given us so far in setting up C4C in Victoria. I'll hand it over to you.
I'm going to be very quick, Chris, and say first of all, congratulations. You and I met earlier this year in Delhi, and you made a very impressive presentation then, and I'm more than happy to assist with C4C. And it's actually fascinating. There are a lot of people on this webinar. They're talking about the Liberal Party and they're talking about policy. That's no branch meeting, there's no minutes, there's no boring elections, there's no more, there's no talk of fundraising or anything like that. This is what we should be doing. And I'd encourage everybody to get involved. And don't expect that any one webinar is going to solve all the problems here. Last week with David Cameron and Malcolm, it was fascinating. They were brief, they were frank, they didn't waffle, they covered issues, they were self-deprecating from time to time. And they also made some pretty important points. And I think David's point, which Tim mentioned about defining the terms of your argument, is a powerful one. The point about the diversity of the conservation exercise. And also the point that Di just made about leading. And there's another point that David Cameron made very passionately. The markets are ahead of all political parties. And the markets are ahead in lots of areas, and we should be feeling comfortable about that. And in fact, our own market in our own constituencies, as Liberals and Nationals, is ahead of the game as well. Our farmers have been ahead of land management for years, and we shouldn't discount that. We won the argument in Victoria about wind energy. We copped a beating for it when we were in opposition. We said it was a planning issue. And it was refreshing to hear David Cameron last week say that that is effectively what it was as well. The wind energy projects in Victoria there were lots of permits, but no one was building them because they weren't financially viable at the time. We won the argument. We introduced planning controls. And whilst there was a bit of noise from the successor government, most of those planning controls remained. And it's an example. We were being beaten up, but we won the argument where we counted. And we won the election as a consequence because we were being genuine. The same with water management, rivers, dams, the works, the same with oceans, the same with our resources, whether it's minerals or rare earth or forest. And I just want to put a plug in at some stage. I hope this group gets to talk about planning and development because there's a world of issues there that we can win if we're clever. And if we win, there'll be better outcomes for particular metropolitan areas where we are building very high cost construction. In fact, some of the highest cost construction in the world, but we don't have the best buildings, we don't have the best designs. We can do much better. And it's another opportunity. I'm not going to carry on. I just want to say, Chris, well done to you and your team. And the more we can be frank about these things, and if somebody wants to leak this stuff to the media, go for it, as far as I'm concerned, because this is just refreshing. It's good that the Liberal Party are doing something like this. It's good that people in the coalition are talking on an interstate basis and meeting each other, even in these crazy circumstances. Well done, happy to be involved.
Thank you, Ted, for such encouraging words. And you'll be glad to hear that planning and development is in the agenda for Victoria. So definitely a very important topic, and we want to discuss it. And we'll organize events surrounding that topic too. So thank you for joining us, albeit last minute. Always good to see you. I will go straight to the Q&A. I just want to know that if Bridget is on the line, because there's quite a few questions for her. So hopefully she's still there. And I'll start with the first question. As both Tim and Bridget mentioned in the promotion materials for tonight's event, the Liberal Party has a strong tradition of conservation in Victoria. Indeed, the founding story of my own organization, Environment Victoria, is entwined with the Hammer government's creation of the Little Desert National Park and establishment of Land Conservation Council, on which my predecessors, along with other stakeholders, held a seat. But the relationship between conservation movement and Liberal Party is not as productive as it once was. Without wanting to open a finger-pointing exercise, I wonder if the panelists have any thoughts on what both sides could do to improve the relationship for the better achievement of conservation and sustainability in Victoria. Would you like to start, Bridget, with answering that question? Just have to unmute you, yeah.
Sorry, Christina, it just broke up a little bit. The relationship, could you just, sorry to get you to repeat that.
It's a very long question, so it's a big statement here. I suppose it's discussing what do you believe could improve the relationship between the issues of conservation and sustainability in Victoria. So the person who's asking is basically saying that the relationship between the conservation movement and the Liberal Party is not aligned.
Well, there's a huge opportunity for alignment. You know, our story is a positive one, as we've heard from I think everyone who's spoken tonight. The Liberal Party, Liberals have a proud tradition when it comes to conservation and prioritising the environment, and sustainability is absolutely intrinsically involved in that. So I think that our job really is to, as Ted just mentioned, is to be candid and have open about conversations about this. That sustainability, you know, whether it's you know, our pursuit of you know, what as individuals, what we can do to you know, in our own backyards, and so many individuals do take many steps to be sustainable in their life, or whether it's at the macro level, and Victorian Liberal governments have been involved in developing and been at the forefront of environmental legislation which is underpinned by sustainability. So there's absolutely an alignment, and of course, you know, we've got Ted on the line, and I just, you know, like to say that it was under, you know, from under the Liberal stewardship of Ted and Dennis Napthine, that in fact our emissions reduced by over 10% during the period that they were leading our government in Victoria. So, and that's, as Ted mentioned it also, you know, we look at our farmers who constantly have sustainable practices in the way they do things. And in fact, when you look at where our emissions are coming from, it's actually agriculture and land use that are actually net, you know, got great advancements when it comes to emissions. In fact, they're net, you know, down on emissions. They're not generating great emissions like electricity or transport. They're actually helping to reduce our net position. So sustainability is critically important. the same as in business, you know, and I just wanted to point out that back when I started my career, you know, Ted talked about markets and business, and we've got a lot to learn, I think, as well from business. And often what governments should be often doing is getting out of the way, but having policies that particularly help smaller and medium businesses to get on board. But you know, when I started my career at Ford Motor Company, you know, not long after I started in 2003, I was really excited when they, you know, Ford in the US, and led by Bill Ford, who was an environmentalist, had the River Rouge complex, which was the largest, you know, huge manufacturing plant built in the 1920s. But in 2003, through sustainable practices, it was reinvigorated and had a, you know, its entire roof, something like 10,000 square metres of green coverage on the roof, and it helped water reticulation and everything. And in 2003, when I started at Ford, that was pretty exciting, and it just shows that there is absolutely an intrinsic link between these things. And yeah, I think that it's incumbent upon us to involve all stakeholders. We've got all kinds of interests from conservation and sustainability, and they go hand in hand and absolutely should do so.
Thank you very much, Bridget.
Yeah.
The next question is, I understand that in Victoria. Yes, Sally, you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I think Bridget raised a really good point. I think so many Liberals are almost unconscious or subconsciously conservationists. And if there's one lesson about the sort of over the last 3 months, it's that people have really only been allowed to leave their homes to go out for a walk, engage with their natural parklands, sort of walk through green spaces along the Yarra, whatever. And now, having had that experience, having been more in touch with nature than arguably they ever have been, I know, certainly talking to many of my friends and some family members, they're much more attuned to the risk of losing that, or losing that privilege, that ability down the track. So I think there is an environment now, certainly a very potent opportunity for us now to talk about the sort of principle that Cameron spoke of last week, that practical sort of environmentalism that we engage with on a daily basis. And I think, you know, when we can develop policy that reflects that, you know, tackles at this broader environmental climate change issue through, you know, grassroots conservationism, we can have real strong success. And that's I think an improvement to where our party has been on these issues in the past anyway. So,
good point, Sally. We'll move on to the next one. I understand that in Victoria, 3 of the main baseload coal-fired power stations are burning brown coal, which is roughly double the emissions of black coal power stations. Are there any plans to retire those power stations, or could they be converted to black coal or gas turbines? Would you be in the position to answer to that, Bridget?
Sure. Look, at the outset, let me say that energy is not, you know, my portfolio isn't energy, but so I've got to be careful when I talk about areas that aren't my area of responsibility. However, when it comes to, you know, coal, and I think that, you know, really to the point of the question, in terms of converting these or repurposing any of these plants, you know, it's the commercial considerations as well as the environmental considerations come into play, and many of the companies and businesses that have these plants probably, I would hazard a guess, find it potentially commercially prohibitive to significantly repurpose some of these plants, for example, transforming coal to, you know, good station coal to gas. It's I'd have to say, look, without being an expert, is probably infeasible. However, you know, when it comes to these energy companies, in terms of the, you know, they've made it clear. They've made it clear, and you can only see with the example of Hazelwood that commercial considerations come into play, and they've made it clear that over time they intend to come out of coal and retire that. So, you know, specifically, I couldn't say when in Victoria, when they'd be entirely retired, or if they'd be entirely retired. But these businesses have conveyed that to markets that's their intention over time, and we're seeing that right around the world. And I think, as has been mentioned, you know, in the past, you know, renewables by far are more cheaper, is much cheaper these days, and there's much more investment in that. But what we need to, you know, what could be contemplated perhaps or encouraged is carbon capture storage, and whether any of these current existing coal operations could invest to carbon capture storage. Now, that would again be very costly, but that's something that potentially they could be asked if they could do that in the short and medium term.
Do any of the panelists would like to say anything else, add anything else to that, or we'll move on? Well, the next question is, what's your position? I assume you, Bridget, what's your position on old growth logging?
My position is that there should be no, in fact, there is no old growth logging. It's a fallacy that is painted by the left that there is old growth logging. There hasn't been any old growth logging in Victoria for a very long, very long time. It's absolutely bipartisan or multi-partisan, as I guess you have to know that there's lots of minor parties these days in the upper house, but it's absolutely bipartisan, you know, around no old growth logging, because it just hasn't been happening. So if you hear, you know, if any communities, and you know, some communities might be told by our Labor government or by the Greens that it's happening today, it's a lie, because it isn't. You know, sadly, and excuse me if you can hear my dog barking in the background, sadly, the Andrews government recently announced that it was going to shut down forestry in Victoria, and all this means is more and more hardship for country communities that rely on forestry and the jobs that it creates, not only for foresters, but also all of the supply chain of businesses, and even the Victorian government's own agency, Vic Forests, in its most recent annual report, tells us clearly in black and white in writing in its report that forestry in Victoria is sustainable, and there's a huge program around regeneration and reforestation, and that it's absolutely sustainable. The reality is there's no old growth forestry, and hasn't been for a long time.
Thank you, Bridget. Another question for you: is the Victorian Coalition opposition prepared to commit to following the South Australian and Tasmanian Liberal government's policy to go 100% renewables? That's again a renewable.
Again, so yeah, I preface it by, you know, energy is not my portfolio, but whilst I'm a huge fan of renewables, and as we've talked about, you know, I mean, even I'll tell you a little story, you know, well before I was married, and where my parents, in fact, my parents still live today, and where I, you know, was growing up before I got married, lived entirely on renewable energy. In fact, my parents' property still to this day is not connected to the grid. So I've lived and breathed living with renewable, with both wind and solar power. So I know that having lived in it, I know that the challenges exist when it comes to, you know, around its efficacy from a base load power generation perspective. So I'm a huge fan of renewables. It's great that technological advancements are coming forward so that it's cheaper, more accessible, and we should absolutely support, you know, we should be happy that there's an increase, you know, increasing propensity to use renewable energy. But as part of the mix. Well, that's what I would say, as part of the mix, because we need to know that we need to have sound, robust base load power generation to support industry, which ultimately supports jobs.
Thank you. We've only got time for one more question, and I'll go back to your portfolio this time. But how can we ensure biodiversity loss is given more attention in the political discourse and not just renewable energy and climate change?
Biodiversity laws, was that?
Just biodiversity in general, I assume.
Yep.
The question, there's more to this question, I'll read the rest. The May 2019 IPBES report highlighted that up to 1 million species are facing extinction, and that habitat loss through land clearing is ranked first, and direct exploitation through trade ranks second, are the main threats to species, not climate change, which ranks third. So how can we ensure there's a greater level of transparency and accountability for timely results?
Biodiversity is critically important because we can only have, like I said, earlier in my initial remarks, that a healthy environment is absolutely critical. I represent a beautiful part of the world. I know Tim said that he represents sort of the best part of Victoria. Well, I have to dispute him. I represent the Yarra Valley. It's a gorgeous part of the world. And the fact is that we, part of the attraction of the Yarra Valley is our beautiful environment and the biodiversity that we have here. It helps in our local economy for tourism, jobs, and farming operations. And so biodiversity is so important. I mean, I'm talking just about my own local community. I think that it's generally, sometimes it's about the approach, but generally when it comes to biodiversity and, it being important, I think it's a bipartisan thing generally between, whether it's a Labor or a Liberal government in Victoria. However, the government, most recently the government's, have to say the Andrews government's dropped the ball on some areas. We look at the recent VAGO, or Victorian Auditor General, has just recently handed its report or tabled its report in Parliament around critically endangered grasslands in Victoria. And the Victorian government sadly has not progressed this area sufficiently, and these endangered grasslands are still at huge risk. So there's definitely more that can be done to highlight these issues. We look at the recent bushfires and the devastation that's caused, and the impact that has to biodiversity. So it's very important that we go in after significant events like the bushfires to assess damage, whether it's damage to our habitat or to our wildlife, and make sure, I know that there was a case. There was an endangered bird species in the Malakuta region, and vets went in there to take the birds out in case fire got there. So biodiversity is extremely important. But I'd just like to talk about, that we have to contemplate. It's really a holistic approach. We look at the industrial fire in, like I said earlier, how there's been rogue operators and hazardous waste and industrial fires over in Footscray. The Stony Creek is at critical risk. It still suffers from, biodiversity impacts because of the toxicity in that creek. The EPA says don't go there today. 18 or plus months after that industrial fire. So biodiversity is very important, and it's not. There's no simple answer here, but definitely I think we need governments can play a part to make sure that it's completely sustained. And the sustainability going forward.
Thanks, Bridget. We have run out of time, so I will ask our C4C Director, Toby Wooldridge, to do a vote of thanks before I announce our next exciting event to all of you. So Toby has been actively engaged in politics, and as a student and member of the Liberal Party, he believes that the center-right of politics has an important role to play in broadening the debate on environmental issues. And he's confident to campaign for us on these matters as part of our team now. So I'll give you the word, Toby. Are you there?
Yes, thanks, Chris. And a very big thank you to Tim and Bridget for your support and valuable input at our inaugural Coalition for Conservation event this evening. We're really grateful to have had two very talented and knowledgeable MPs at both the state and federal level give us a view on how the centre-right can champion these environmental challenges, particularly whilst supporting the economy. And both Bridget and Tim outlined a number of the core principles that have motivated their involvement in public policy to date, and highlighted how these beliefs are crystallised, and there's a lot of crossover with the environmental policy debate. There was a strong focus throughout both of their speeches on practical policies and the need for us as Liberals to focus on being consistent with our values by empowering individuals to take responsibility for their actions and not be led by solely by an internationalist styled agenda. Our panellists all emphasised the strong track record of past Liberal governments on the environment, but acknowledged that the Liberal narrative around the environment and conservation has been missing in recent years, but I'm confident we're in good hands now. And after tonight's discussion, Tim and Bridget have shown that they're well equipped and motivated to reinvigorate this Liberal narrative on the environment moving forward. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. We really appreciate your company, and the Coalition for Conservation is aiming to create a positive agenda for the environment across the Liberal and Conservative movement. We want to lead a mobilised and motivated forum which tackles the important issues head on and broadens the conservation debate, not just the climate change topic, but as David Cameron said, everything from the street corner to the stratosphere. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Christina.
Thanks, Toby. So if anyone wants to join, now that we have officially launched in Victoria, our directors Sali, Di, and Toby are there. You can contact us, sending us an email to get their personal contacts, and I'm sure that they can discuss with you what our agenda is. If anyone wants to support and be part of the group, we're here. So before you all go, I would just like to announce our next event, which will be on the 4th of August, still a webinar because we are not hosting face-to-face events yet, but it is part of our engagement with the UK Conservatives, which has been quite strong lately. We're thrilled to have Lord Deben, which is well, he was the Environment Minister during John Major's government in the UK. Now he's the chair of the UK Committee on Climate Change. He will be with us on a webinar to discuss the UK Conservative leadership on climate and also the post-COVID recovery. And together with him, we will have one of our ambassadors, Robert Hill, which used to be a senator for South Australia. So we'd love for you all to join our group for this webinar. If you haven't yet signed up and doesn't receive our invitations, please go online on coalitionforconservation.com.au. So I hope you all enjoyed the webinar and what we heard about Victoria. So stay safe. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much for everyone who attended, especially Bridget, Tim, and our C4C directors and ambassadors. Thank you, Ted. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.